students.
I call Holly Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll begin in part two where the previous speaker left off, looking at Clause 57, replacing Section 146, and looking at the discretion given to the Commissioner to grant relief from late payment interest. We agree it's very sensible that the Commissioner has that kind of discretion to grant relief to borrowers who are charged late payment interest and penalties on their student loans. As we have heard, those can be significant, and it's sensible that the Commissioner has that kind of discretion. It would be good if the Commissioner still had the same discretion through the 3-year repayment holiday provision, which has been repealed and shortened to 1 year, to grant relief from late payment interest and penalties to borrowers living overseas who are there for more than 1 year, as most New Zealand graduates are. And it's an example, Mr. Chair, of the inconsistency between some of the sensible provisions of this bill and the series of very damaging changes to the student loan scheme that have been made over a number of years by this government. Indeed, Mr. Chair, I think the kind of discretion described in new Section 1 or replacement Section 146 in Part 2 is the kind of discretion that my colleague Tracy Martin was talking about earlier in the debate when she talked about the discretion for individual circumstances, including borrowers living in New Zealand who may become learners at different stages throughout their lives to have the ability to take a repayment holiday, for example, from their student loan. Sensible provisions similar to what's proposed here, and yet not supported by this House. Mr. Chairman, while I'm on the subject of the contribution from my colleague Tracy Martin earlier, I think it's important to correct the record. She questioned the commitment of both the Green and Labour parties to free tertiary education. I was very pleased to hear my Labour colleagues reiterate Labour Party's commitment to free tertiary education. Of course, the Green and New Zealand First parties are quite aligned on this matter. Like New Zealand First, we stand for a universal student allowance. We stand for the reduction of tertiary fees, and we stand for exploring a debt write-off and bonding options under the student loan scheme. So we have a lot in common. Of course, our concern about the financial burden that students and graduates such as myself are dragging around doesn't detract from our commitment to that principled stance on tertiary education. I want to turn my attention briefly to the contribution from the Minister earlier. And I was pleased to hear him say that it would be wrong to see this bill in isolation from the suite of measures introduced over the last 4 to 5 years.
So I remember that was in Part 1, so we're now on Part 2. So just confine your comments now to Part 2.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And indeed, the changes in Part 2 indeed shouldn't be seen in isolation either from the suite of changes that have been made to the student loan scheme over the last 4 to 5 years. And I'd like to review for the House what some of these changes are, because they are very concerning. We've heard in the debate on Part 2 also mention of the lifetime limit of EFTs, the lifetime limit of 7 years of equivalent full-time students, so you can't borrow under the student loan scheme if you have been studying for more than 7 years. That was a change introduced in the last 4 to 5 years by this government, and it's a very punitive change. It means that a student who has completed a 4-year bachelor's degree with honours and then starts a master's and then moves on to a PhD would lose access to their student loan partway through their doctoral study. Similarly, students who are medical students who've been studying for 7 years but are doing an 8-year course would lose access to their student loan before they've completed their medical degree. Similarly, students who undertake bridging courses to prepare themselves for tertiary study and then find that has contributed to their lifetime EFTs limit are unable to borrow later on in their degree. And it's those kinds of changes are very detrimental to those students, and they're part of those suite of changes that we've heard about, which are very concerning. Mr. Chairman, as I began this contribution on Part 2 with the observation that the Commissioner under this part has the discretion to grant relief against financial penalties and late payments. Similarly, as I've mentioned, we've seen a similar discretion be removed from the ability, Mr Chair.
Call Holly Walker.
Removed from the ability to grant a repayment holiday for 3 years, and for that repayment holiday to be reduced to only 1 year. Under Part 2, that kind of discretion is given to the Commissioner, and yet it's removed by some of those other changes we've seen in the last few years. We've also seen reducing the academic requirement that a borrower must have passed at least half of the previous 2 years of study in order to continue qualifying for a student loan, a manifestly unfair measure that was abolished in 1993. We've seen restriction of access to students over 55 so that they can no longer borrow under the student loan scheme, which nonsensically makes it more difficult for older people to upskill and retrain during a period of global economic recession. We've seen the government make it more difficult for new immigrants to qualify for the student loan scheme. We've seen them restrict part-time students from being able to borrow for course-related costs. We've seen an increase in the administration scheme from $50 to $60 per year, and we've seen the introduction of an annual $40 IRD administration fee for graduates who are paying off their loan. As I've mentioned, we've seen the 3-year repayment holiday reduced. We've seen the 10% voluntary repayment abolished, which is also referred to in Part 2 of this bill. And we've seen the student loan repayment rate increase from 10 to 12 cents in the dollar. And Mr Chair, I think it's really important to keep in mind when we're looking at the amendments in this part of the bill and the bill as a whole, is who are the people affected? Because I think this House has a habit of thinking that bills that make amendments to the student loan scheme are about students alone. And actually, most of the time, bills that amend the student loan scheme, including the parts in Part 2, are actually about graduates who are paying off their loans. These are people who have finished studying, who may not have studied now for several years. These are people who are grown-ups. Graduates are grown-ups. They're employees, they're taxpayers. Many of them are aspiring homeowners, they're parents. In fact, Mr Chairman, most of the people affected by this bill are your typical mum and dad New Zealanders, and I put quote marks around that because I hate that phrase. But actually, that's who we're talking about. And I know that many members of this Parliament like to kind of think of students as being freeloading slackers, and that this bill tightening up provisions around the student loan scheme just makes a very generous scheme fairer for students. It's actually not about current students, Mr Chair. It's about graduates, and they are your mum and dad New Zealanders. And I think the government, in its continued slow erosion of the scheme and in making things harder for those graduates, making them pay their loans back at a higher rate, for example, actually puts a lot of pressure on everyday mum and dad New Zealanders. And, they are the people like the journalist that the Minister spoke to, who says they're angry with overseas borrowers. They're also angry about their increased repayment rates, and I think the government ignores that at their peril.
Call Dr. David Clark.
Mr Chair.
Part 2.
Part 2. I'm delighted to speak directly to Part 2, and in particular the